Marcus Stone woke up with a blade at his throat, and that wasn't even the worst part of his morning. The steel was cold, sharp, and felt more intimate than any weapon he'd ever faced in 5 long years of frontier warfare. He'd been on the wrong end of Apache blades before, but this was different. This was personal. He was in his own cabin, on his own cot, and the darkness was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and something else. Sage smoke. A woman's knee was pinning his chest down, her weight surprisingly solid, anchoring him to the mattress. A voice whispered in his ear, quiet and deadly as a rattlesnake in the dust. "My father died in this room last night." Marcus didn't move. He barely breathed. The whiskey from the night before had left his tongue feeling like old leather, but his mind was suddenly crystal clear. He remembered everything. The old man, Takakota, stumbling to his door, clutching a bloody wound in his side. The hours spent boiling water, packing the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. He remembered the life fading from the old chief's eyes. "You were the last one to see him alive," the voice continued, a deadly promise wrapped in a whisper. The knife pressed just a little deeper, drawing a single warm tear of blood from his skin. This was the end, wasn't it? Slain in his own bed by a ghost in the dark. Through the cracked shutters, a sliver of moonlight cut through the gloom. It was just enough to see her face, high cheekbones like they were carved from the canyon rock itself. Eyes so dark they swallowed the light, and they held absolutely no fear. Long black hair framed her face, falling around them both like a funeral shroud. She was Apache, and she was ready to kill him. His hands were at his sides, open and still. He knew one twitch, one wrong word, and this would be over. He could still see the ghost of her father's blood under his own fingernails from where he tried, desperately, to save the man's life. Now the old man's daughter was here to deliver a different kind of justice. He had to choose his next words very, very carefully. They would either be his last or his salvation. "If I wanted your father dead," Marcus said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, barely disturbing the air, "I wouldn't have spent the entire night changing his bandages." The blade trembled, just for a second. It wasn't from fear. Marcus knew rage when he felt it, and the metal against his skin was vibrating with it. He could feel the battle happening inside her, the war between vengeance and doubt. What was she going to choose? She leaned closer, her breath warm against his cheek. He could smell the sage in her hair, see the intricate silver beads woven into the deerskin of her dress. Her body was taut, coiled like a spring, and pressed against his in a way that would have been intoxicating under any other circumstance. Right now, it was just terrifying. "Prove it," she hissed. 2 words, an ultimatum, and Marcus knew his life depended on what he did next. He didn't dare move his head, not with that blade kissing his throat, so he moved his eyes. Just his eyes. He flickered them towards the small, rickety table beside his cot. "Your father's medicine pouch," Marcus said, his voice still low and steady, betraying none of the frantic pounding in his chest. "It's right there, where he left it." He paused, letting her look. "And those rags on the floor, that's from 3 different bandage changes. I ran out of clean cloth before dawn." She followed his gaze, but the knife never moved. Not a millimeter. On the floor next to the table was a small pile of torn, blood-soaked strips of his own shirt. The sharp herbal scent of yarrow and willow bark, Apache medicine, hung faintly in the air. Her free hand slowly, cautiously, reached out, and her fingers brushed against the worn leather of the medicine pouch. She knew it. It was her father's. "You could have set this up," she said, but a tiny crack had appeared in her voice, the first seed of doubt. "Could have," Marcus agreed. "But I didn't." He watched her face, searching for any sign of softening. There was none. She was a fortress. "Before he died, your father told me things. He told me about Ayakoa. He told me about the betrayal." The knife dug in again, harder this time. A fresh line of warmth trickled down his neck. "You know nothing of my uncle," she spat. "I know he's planning to get a lot of good people killed," Marcus countered, pushing his luck. "Apache people. White people. It doesn't matter to him." He risked a tiny shift of his weight, just to see what would happen. She didn't slice his throat open. That was a good sign. Your father, he wanted it stopped. He came to me for help. My father is dead because of the greed of white men. Her thigh tensed against his ribs, her anger a palpable force. Because of men who look just like you. Maybe, Marcus conceded. He had to give her that. But right now, a man who looks just like me is the only one who can get close enough to Ayakoa's camp to find out what's really going on, and to stop it. Silence. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of their breathing. Her dark eyes scanned his face, searching for lies, for deception, for any reason to finish what she started. The moonlight caught the sweat on her skin, tracing the delicate line of her collarbone. She was trying to read his soul, and then she pulled the knife back. Just an inch. I am Kaya, she said, her voice now holding a different kind of weight. Not just anger, but sorrow. Takakota was my father. She finally moved, shifting her weight off him. I watched your cabin all night, from the ridge line. I saw you carry him inside. I saw the lamp burning until the sun came up. Marcus let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding for an eternity. His throat ached. Then you know I tried to help him, he said, pushing himself up onto his elbows. I know you failed, she shot back, her words like stones. The blade was still in her hand. But maybe you didn't fail alone. She looked at him, really looked at him, and he saw something flicker in her eyes. A new calculation. What did my father tell you? He said Ayakoa made a deal with the devil, Marcus said, rubbing his throat. That he was trading Apache lives for gold. That he was leading soldiers to winter camps. Kaya's face hardened into a mask of pure grief. It's worse than that. He's not just leading them. He's choosing them. The families who spoke out against him. The ones who still believed in the old ways. He's using the soldiers to eliminate his rivals. And he's planning something big. A raid on the trading post at Canyon Creek. She paused. It's happening in 3 days. How do you know that? Marcus asked. A bitter, cold smile touched her lips. Because he tried to recruit me. He told me my father had finally seen the future, that he had joined him. She looked away toward the dirty window. He lied. My father came here to warn you, to warn someone. He knew he was being watched. And that's when the first real piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Marcus. It wasn't just a random attack that had wounded Takakota. He wasn't just found by Marcus by chance. The old chief was running. He was being hunted. So his death, Marcus started, was no accident, Kaya finished, her eyes flashing. His wound wasn't from a stray bullet. It was from one of Ayakoa's men. My father was silenced before he could expose the truth. She rolled off the cot in a single fluid motion, landing on her feet with the grace of a panther. The loss of her warmth, of her weight, left a strange, cold void on his chest. She sheathed the knife at her belt. You want to stop him? She asked, her voice now all business. Then you're going to need me. A white man wandering into Apache territory asking questions is just a man asking to die. Marcus sat up fully now, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. The floorboards were cold beneath his feet. And what makes you think I can trust you? He asked, his voice rough. You just held a knife to my throat. Kaya turned back from the window, and the morning light, just beginning to peek over the horizon, framed her silhouette. Because my father trusted you. He died on your floor trying to get a message to you. She took a step closer. And because I need you, Ayakoa expects me to mourn. He won't expect me to be working with the man he thinks is just a dumb, white frontiersman. There was another reason. He could see it in her eyes. It was the same fire he saw in the mirror some mornings. The fire of someone who had lost everything. We do this, she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper, to get justice for my father and to kill my uncle. They left at dawn. The plan was simple and dangerous. Kaya's hands were bound in front of her with a length of rope. To anyone watching from the ridges, she would look like Marcus Stone's prisoner. It was a lie they had to live, a piece of theater that might just keep them alive. Traveling through this disputed land, a white man and an Apache woman together would draw bullets from both sides. But a white man with a captive? That was a story people understood. The rope was real enough, and it bit into Kaya's wrists, rubbing them raw. But she never made a sound of complaint. Marcus watched her walk beside his horse, her stride long and sure-footed, her back straight. She seemed to be drawing strength from the pain, turning it into fuel. Every step they took towards Ayakoa's hidden stronghold was a step closer to a reckoning. "Tell me about him," Marcus said, his voice low. They were picking their way up a steep, rocky ravine, and the sound of his horse's hooves echoed off the canyon walls. "Your uncle. What kind of man sells out his own blood?" Kaya didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the treacherous trail ahead. "He wasn't always this way," she said, her breathing even despite the climb. "He was a great war chief once. He fought beside Cochise. He believed in our people. What changed him?" She stopped walking then and turned to face him. Her eyes were like burning coals. "Gold," she said, the word a curse on her lips. "And promises. The white men in the territory, the powerful ones, they whispered in his ear. They showed him maps." Her laugh was a short, bitter sound. "They promised him his own kingdom, a reservation where he would be chief, recognized by the government. All he had to do was help them clean up the Apache problem. He's helping them kill his own people for a piece of paper?" Marcus felt a cold knot of disgust tighten in his stomach. "He doesn't see it that way," Kaya said, starting to walk again. "He calls it pruning the vine. He says some branches must be cut so the rest can grow strong. He targets the families who resist the white expansion, the ones who want to fight. He calls them weak. He tells his warriors that he is carving out a safe future for the Apache, a future where we have a home, by destroying everything you stand for." "Exactly." Her voice cracked, just for a moment. "My father was the last chief who dared to speak against him in council. He called Ayakoa a traitor, and for that, Ayakoa marked him for death." She glanced back at him. "He told everyone my father was a fool, an old man clinging to the past. He said my father's ideas would lead to our extinction." The story was getting darker, more twisted with every detail. This wasn't just about greed. This was about ideology, about a civil war brewing within the Apache nation, fueled and funded by corrupt officials. Ayakoa wasn't just a bandit. He was a would-be king, building his throne on the bones of his own people. And then Kaya dropped the next bombshell. "That medicine pouch," she said suddenly. "My father's pouch. Did you look inside?" "No," Marcus said. "It wasn't my place." She stopped again. "Give it to me." He hesitated. It felt like a test. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the small, beaded leather pouch. He leaned down from his horse to hand it to her. She worked at the drawstring with her bound fingers, her movements clumsy but determined. Finally, she got it open and tipped the contents into her palm. There were dried herbs, a small, smooth river stone, a bird's feather, and something else, a piece of metal. It was a small brass key, old and ornate. It wasn't Apache. It was a white man's key. "What is that?" Marcus asked, his curiosity piqued. Kaya stared at the key in her palm, her expression unreadable. "It's the reason my father was killed," she said softly, "and it's the one thing Ayakoa doesn't know about." She closed her fingers around it, hiding it from view. "This key," she said, looking up at him with an intensity that chilled him to the bone, "opens a lockbox at the trading post in Canyon Creek. The same trading post Ayakoa is planning to raid." Suddenly, the raid wasn't just a raid. It was a mission. Ayakoa wasn't just after supplies and gold. He was after whatever this key protected. "What's in the box?" Marcus asked. Kaya tucked the key back into the pouch and pulled the drawstring tight. "Proof," she said. "The original treaty signed by the elders, granting land rights to the families Ayakoa is now hunting. Ledgers, records of payments from his white partners." She looked up at the sky. "It's everything we need to expose him, not just as a killer, but as a thief who is stealing the future of our people for men who will betray him the second he's no longer useful." The stakes had just been raised. This wasn't just about stopping a raid anymore. It was about recovering the evidence that could bring the entire conspiracy crashing down. And they had less than 3 days to get to it before Ayakoa burned it all to the ground. They made camp that night in a narrow slot canyon, the red sandstone walls rising up on either side of them like silent sentinels. A sliver of starry sky was visible overhead. Marcus built a small, smokeless fire in a pit, using dry wood that wouldn't betray their position. While he worked, Kaya, still bound, used her knowledge of the land to find edible roots and leaves. When she knelt by the trickle of water at the canyon's edge to wash the dirt from her findings, Marcus couldn't help but watch her. The firelight flickered across her face, casting shadows in the hollows of her cheeks. Her focus was absolute. There was a strength in her, a quiet, unbreakable will that called to a part of him he thought he'd buried a long time ago. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her task. Her voice was flat, an observation, not an accusation. "Sorry," he mumbled, turning his attention back to the flames. But the image of her was seared into his mind. "I didn't say I minded," she said, and he could hear the hint of a smile in her voice. She stood up and walked toward the fire, her movements slow and deliberate. "But if we're going to trust each other with our lives, you should probably know who I am." "I know you're Takakota's daughter," he said. "I'm more than that," she replied, stopping just on the other side of the fire from him. The flames danced between them, painting her in hues of orange and red. "Ayakoa, he asked me to be his wife." Marcus froze. This was a complication he hadn't anticipated, a massive one. "What did you say?" "I told him I would consider it if he could prove his path was the true path for our people." Her expression was grim. It was a lie, of course, a way to buy time, a way to get close to him, to learn his plans. "I have been playing a very dangerous game for a very long time," Marcus Stone. She was a spy. She hadn't just been waiting on the sidelines. She had been in the heart of the enemy's camp, risking everything. Her father's death hadn't started her war. It had just changed the rules. "Men have underestimated me my whole life," she continued, her voice low and fierce. "White men see an Apache woman and think she is a prize to be taken. My own people see a chief's daughter and think she is a pawn to be married off for a political alliance. Ayakoa sees a niece he can control." She took a step around the fire, closer to him. "They are all wrong." He met her gaze. The firelight reflected in her dark eyes, and for the first time, he saw past the warrior, past the grieving daughter, and saw the woman herself. She was formidable. "What kind of man are you, Marcus Stone?" she asked, turning his own question back on him. The question hung in the air, heavier than the silence of the desert night. He could have given her a simple answer, a rancher, an ex-soldier, a drifter. But she had shown him her truth, and she deserved his. "I'm the kind of man who was supposed to be a hero," he said, his voice rough with memory. "I was a captain in the army. I had a command, a future." He stared into the flames, but he wasn't seeing them. He was seeing a different fire, a different time. "We were given orders to clear a valley. We were told it was a nest of hostiles. We rode in at dawn." He swallowed hard. "They weren't warriors, Kaya. They were families. Old men, women, children. It was a winter camp. Just like the ones you said Ayakoa is targeting." The guilt was a physical thing, a weight that had been crushing him for years. "I gave the order. My men, we did what we were told." He couldn't look at her. He was confessing to a massacre, to the very kind of atrocity her uncle was now committing. He expected her to recoil, to pull a knife, to look at him with the hatred he deserved. Instead, she knelt beside him. Her presence was a quiet comfort, not a judgment. "And then what?" she whispered. "I left," he said, his voice cracking. "I threw down my commission, my uniform, my name. I rode away, and I never looked back. I built that cabin with my own two hands, thinking if I lived a quiet life, I could outrun the ghosts." He finally looked at her. "But you can't, can you? They always find you." Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't pity. It was understanding. "No," she said softly. "You can't." Her hand came up, and her fingers gently touched the side of his face. It wasn't a lover's touch. It was something deeper, a touch of recognition. She was looking at a fellow survivor. "You're not that man anymore, Marcus." "How do you know?" Because that man would have left my father to die in the dirt, she said. That man wouldn't be here right now, risking his life to help me. You didn't run from this fight. You ran towards it. Her thumb brushed against his cheek. Maybe we can't outrun our ghosts, Marcus, but maybe we can learn to fight alongside them. The space between them crackled with an energy that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a fragile, powerful connection forged in truth and shared pain. He had seen the warrior. Now she had seen the broken soldier. And somehow they were still sitting here together. Kaya, he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Yes. If we do this, if we go after that lockbox, Ayakoa will hunt us to the ends of the earth. Her smile was the saddest, most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Then we better give him a reason to remember our names, she said, and she leaned in and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a seal, a promise, a quiet acknowledgement that in this brutal, unforgiving land, two broken people had just found the one thing they couldn't survive without, each other. But as he kissed her back, a cold thought slithered into his mind. She had been playing a dangerous game with Ayakoa for months, pretending to be someone she wasn't. How could he be absolutely sure she wasn't playing one with him right now? The second day of their journey was a nightmare of heat and dust. They pushed themselves and the horses hard, moving through a landscape of barren rock and thorny scrub that seemed determined to rip them to pieces. The silence between them was different now. After their confessions by the fire, a new fragile intimacy had taken root, but it was overshadowed by the ticking clock and the constant threat of discovery. Late in the afternoon, as they were navigating a winding, dry riverbed, Kaya suddenly held up a hand, signaling for a halt. Wait, she whispered, her eyes scanning the high ridges above them. Marcus pulled his horse to a stop, his own hand instinctively going to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. What is it? Riders, she said, pointing to a distant plume of dust rising against the impossibly blue sky. 3 of them, moving fast. Ayakoa's men? No, she said, her eyes narrowing. They ride like white men, and they're not trying to be quiet. She slid off his horse's back, moving with practiced speed. Untie me, quickly. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second. The rope was their cover story, but the urgency in her voice was undeniable. He dismounted and sawed through the rope with his belt knife. The moment her hands were free, she was a different person. She grabbed the Winchester from his saddle, her movements fluid and efficient. Get the horses into that outcropping, she ordered, pointing to a cluster of boulders 50 yards ahead. I'll find a high spot. Before he could argue, she was gone, scrambling up the side of the riverbed with the agility of a mountain goat, disappearing into the rocks. Marcus cursed under his breath and led the horses to cover, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He trusted her. He had to. But everything in his soldier's brain screamed that splitting up was a terrible idea. He secured the horses and pulled out his own rifle, finding a defensive position behind the largest boulder. He peered over the top, trying to locate the riders. He saw them now, cresting a nearby hill. They were white men, all right, hard-looking men with rifles held at the ready. Bounty hunters? A posse? Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. The man in the lead was wearing the uniform of a U.S. Army scout. This wasn't a random encounter. They were being hunted. But how? How could anyone have tracked them so quickly? Had Ayakoa already sent word to his white allies? A single rifle shot cracked through the silence. It wasn't from the riders. It was from above him, from Kaya's position. One of the riders screamed and toppled from his saddle. The other 2 immediately spurred their horses, charging straight for Marcus's position. They knew exactly where he was. It was an ambush, but the ambushers had been ambushed themselves. Bullets sparked off the rocks around him as he returned fire, dropping one of the charging horses. The rider went down in a cloud of dust, but came up shooting. Marcus ducked back behind the boulder as lead whizzed past his ear. This was bad, very bad. 2 trained men, closing in, and Kaya was pinned down somewhere above him. He was trapped, and then he heard a voice shout, a voice that was chillingly familiar. Stone! Marcus Stone! I know you're in there. The colonel wants to talk to you. the scout. Marcus racked his brain, trying to place the voice, and then it hit him. Sergeant Miller, a man who had served under him, a man he'd once trusted with his life, a man who was now trying to kill him. How was he here? What was happening? "It doesn't have to go this way, Captain," Miller shouted, his voice closer now. "Just give us the girl. The colonel will be very generous." The girl? They weren't after him. They were after Kaya. But why? They called him Captain. They knew who he was. This wasn't Ayakoa's doing. This was something else. This was his old life, his ghosts, reaching out to drag him back into the grave he'd dug for himself. Another shot rang out from Kaya's position, and the second rider grunted in pain. Marcus seized the opportunity. He vaulted over the boulder, firing his rifle from the hip. He saw Miller diving for cover, his face a mask of shock and rage. The pieces were flying together in his head, forming a terrifying picture. Miller worked for the Army. The Army was supposed to be fighting the hostile Apaches. But Ayakoa was working with corrupt officials. Officials like Colonel Harrison, the man who had given Marcus the order to attack that winter camp years ago. The man responsible for his disgrace. It was all connected. Harrison, Ayakoa, the massacre, his past, and now Kaya. Kaya wasn't just a target because of Ayakoa. She was a target because of him. Harrison must have known Takakota had come to see him. He must have had Marcus's cabin watched. When the old chief turned up dead and Marcus disappeared with his daughter, Harrison must have assumed the worst. That Takakota had talked. That Marcus now knew the full extent of his treason. Harrison had sent Miller, his old subordinate, to clean up the mess, to kill Marcus and to capture Kaya, the last living witness besides Ayakoa. "Miller!" Marcus yelled, taking cover behind another rock. "Harrison's playing you. He's in bed with Ayakoa. They're killing everyone, soldier and civilian alike." "Lies!" Miller screamed back. "Harrison's a patriot. He's cleaning up this territory. And you're a deserter and a traitor, Stone. You and that Apache witch." There was no reasoning with him. Miller was a zealot, blinded by loyalty to a corrupt commander. Marcus knew he had only one option. He checked his rifle. 2 shots left. He had a revolver with a full cylinder. It wasn't much against 2 determined men. He glanced up towards the ridge where Kaya was hidden. There had been no more shots from her. Was she hit? Out of ammo? Or was she doing something else? He had to make a choice. Stay pinned down and wait for the inevitable, or make a break for it. He was about to risk everything on a desperate charge when he saw it, a flicker of movement on the ridge, far to Miller's left. It was Kaya. She wasn't pinned down at all. She had been repositioning. She raised her rifle, but she wasn't aiming at Miller or the other man. She was aiming higher, at the precariously balanced rock formation directly above their position. A cold, brilliant smile touched Marcus's lips. She wasn't just a fighter. She was a strategist. She fired. The bullet struck the rock face, and then a second shot and a third. A deep groaning sound echoed through the canyon as tons of rock and sandstone began to shift. Miller and his partner looked up, their faces etched with horror. "Now, Marcus!" Kaya's voice screamed from the ridge. He didn't need to be told twice. He broke from cover, running low and fast towards the horses as the landslide began. It started as a trickle of pebbles, then a cascade of boulders. Then the entire cliff face seemed to collapse in on itself, coming down with a deafening roar. It buried the 2 soldiers and their horses in an avalanche of red dust and shattered rock. The canyon fell silent, the only sound the faint trickle of settling dust. Marcus reached the horses, his lungs burning. A moment later, Kaya slid down the scree slope, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes bright with adrenaline. She ran to him, and he grabbed her, pulling her into a fierce embrace. For a moment, they just held each other, the reality of their narrow escape washing over them. "You were right," he said, his voice hoarse. "This is bigger than Ayakoa." He pulled back to look at her. "It's Harrison. He's been pulling the strings all along, and he sent my old sergeant to kill me." Kaya's expression was grim. "Then the lockbox at the trading post is even more important. It won't just expose my uncle. It could bring down the man who is trying to burn this entire territory to the ground." She looked at the fresh mound of rock and dirt where the soldiers were buried. They knew where we were. They tracked us. How? Marcus asked, the question that had been bothering him all along. Kaya's gaze fell to the saddlebags on his horse. My father was a clever man, she said quietly. He knew he might not survive the journey to your cabin. He knew Ayakoa or Harrison's men might be following him. She reached into the saddlebag and pulled out the medicine pouch. She opened it and took out the smooth riverstone. She held it up. It looked perfectly ordinary. But then she twisted it. The stone split in two, held together by a tiny, ingenious hinge. Inside, nestled in a small, hollowed-out space, was not a secret message or a map. It was a tiny, intricate piece of clockwork. A small gear, a tightly wound spring. It was a tracking device. Primitive, but effective. A small, magnetized needle on a pivot pointed unerringly north. But beneath it, another smaller needle quivered, pointing in a completely different direction. It's a lodestone compass, Marcus breathed, recognizing the principle. More than that, Kaya said. There's a second one. My father left it with a friend, a merchant at Canyon Creek. The stones are linked, a sympathy of elements. One always points to the other. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a terrible realization. They weren't tracking us. They were tracking the pouch. Harrison doesn't just want me silenced. He wants whatever my father was carrying. And then the most horrifying thought of all struck Marcus. The key. Harrison wasn't just after the pouch. He was after the key inside it. The lockbox didn't just contain proof against Ayakoa. It must contain the proof against Harrison, too. That's why he was so desperate to get his hands on it. And they were walking right into his trap. The trading post at Canyon Creek wasn't just the target of Ayakoa's raid. It was the center of the entire conspiracy. And Harrison's men would be waiting for them. They rode with a new, desperate urgency. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a whispered warning. They knew they were riding into the lion's den, but they had no other choice. The lockbox was everything. We can't just ride in the front gate, Marcus said as they reined in their horses on a ridge overlooking the small, dusty settlement of Canyon Creek. The trading post was the largest building, a squat, fortified structure with thick adobe walls. A few smaller shacks and corrals were scattered around it. Lights were beginning to twinkle in the windows. It looked peaceful, deceptively so. There's a back way, Kaya said, pointing towards a narrow arroyo that ran behind the main building. It leads to the storerooms. My father used it to trade without being seen by the soldiers from the fort. Is your father's friend, the merchant, still there? Can we trust him? Kaya's expression clouded over. His name is Silas. He is complicated. He values gold above all else. My father paid him well to keep the box safe. But if Harrison offered him more... She let the sentence hang in the air. So we're walking in blind, Marcus summarized grimly. Not entirely blind, she said. She reached into her boot and pulled out a small, wicked-looking knife. I have this. She then looked at him, a serious, calculating expression on her face. You said Miller called you Captain. You said Harrison was your old commander. There's more to your story than just one bad day in a valley, isn't there? He owed her the whole truth. Harrison didn't just give the order, Marcus confessed, his voice low. He fabricated the intelligence. He told us the camp was full of warriors who had just raided a settlement. He showed us reports, eyewitness accounts. It was all a lie. He wanted that valley cleared because a railroad survey team wanted to go through it. He manufactured a battle to justify a massacre. And you found out. Afterwards, I found a survivor, a young boy. He told me the truth. I confronted Harrison. He told me to keep my mouth shut, or I'd be buried in a military prison for a war crime he himself had orchestrated. Marcus's hands tightened on the reins. So I ran. I deserted. I became Marcus Stone, the quiet rancher, because I was a coward. You weren't a coward, Marcus, Kaya said, her voice soft but firm. You were a man trying to survive in a world run by monsters. Now we have a chance to hunt them back. They left the horses hidden and made their way down to the arroyo under the cover of darkness. The back entrance to the trading post was a heavy wooden door barred from the inside. There was no way to force it without making a scene. Now what? Marcus whispered. Kaya didn't answer. She put her fingers to her lips and let out a soft, low whistle that sounded exactly like a night bird. They waited. A minute passed, then another. Marcus was about to suggest they find another way when he heard the faint sound of a heavy bar being lifted on the other side of the door. The door creaked open just a crack. A man's weathered face, half hidden in shadow, peered out. He had a long, drooping mustache and nervous, shifty eyes. Kaya, is that you? What in blazes are you doing here? Your father said— Silas, Kaya cut him off, her voice sharp. We need the box, now. The box? Are you crazy? The man hissed, opening the door just enough for them to slip inside. He immediately barred it behind them. They were in a dark, cluttered storeroom that smelled of cured leather, tobacco, and dust. Ayakoa's warriors are set to hit this place before dawn, and there are other men here, asking questions. Hard-looking men. Harrison's men, Marcus said. It was a statement, not a question. Silas's eyes widened in fear. You need to leave. Both of you. Take what you want from the store, but I want no part of this. We're not leaving without my father's property, Kaya said, her voice leaving no room for argument. You gave him your word, Silas. The merchant wrung his hands, his face slick with sweat in the dim lantern light. A word doesn't mean much when men with guns are involved. They offered me $1,000 in gold for that box, Kaya. 1,000. And what did you tell them? Marcus asked, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about, Silas squeaked. But they don't believe me. They're watching me. They're staying in the room above the store. So Harrison's men were right here, in the same building. This was worse than they could have imagined. Get the box, Silas, Marcus said, his voice cold as ice. Now. Trembling, Silas led them through the storeroom to a section of the floor covered by a large bearskin rug. He pulled it aside to reveal a hidden trapdoor. He fumbled with a ring pull and lifted it, revealing a small dark cellar. He scurried down the ladder and returned a moment later, grunting under the weight of a heavy iron lockbox, about the size of a saddlebag. It was secured with a large ornate brass lock, the lock that matched Kaya's key. Here, Silas panted, setting it on the floor. Take it and go, please. Kaya knelt and pulled the medicine pouch from her belt. She took out the key and was about to insert it into the lock when a floorboard creaked loudly from the main store area, just beyond the storeroom door. They all froze. Heavy footsteps approached the door. Silas? A gruff voice called out. You in there? We heard voices. Silas looked like he was about to faint. His eyes darted between them and the door, pure panic on his face. He was the weak link. He was going to betray them. Marcus could see it in his eyes. Before Marcus or Kaya could react, Silas made his move. But it wasn't what they expected. It's just rats, Mr. Jones, Silas shouted towards the door, his voice high and shaky. Big ones. I'm setting traps. Then he turned to them, his face a mask of desperation. There's a tunnel, he whispered frantically, pointing to the back of the cellar. It comes out in the old smithy, 100 yards from here. Go. I'll try to stall them. Why? Marcus asked, stunned by the sudden change of heart. Silas looked at Kaya, and for the first time Marcus saw something other than greed in the man's eyes. It was shame. Your father, he was a good man. He was my friend. He pushed the heavy box towards them. Now get out of here before you get us all killed. There was no time to argue. Marcus grabbed one handle of the box. Kaya took the other, and they half-carried, half-dragged it to the open trapdoor. As they descended into the musty darkness of the cellar, they heard the storeroom door being thrown open. What's this cellar for, Silas? The gruff voice demanded. Storage. Old furs, nothing important. Silas's voice was getting weaker. They found the tunnel entrance behind a stack of rotting barrels. It was a dark, narrow hole, barely big enough to crawl through. As Marcus pushed the box into the opening, he heard a sickening thud from the room above, followed by Silas's pained grunt. Then the gruff voice again, cold and final. He was lying. Find them. They scrambled into the tunnel, pulling the lockbox after them. The darkness was absolute, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. Behind them, they could hear the heavy boots of Harrison's men climbing down into the cellar. They were trapped underground, in a suffocatingly tight space, with their enemies just feet away. The race wasn't over. It had just moved into the dark. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. It was a tight squeeze for one person, let alone two people trying to haul a heavy iron box. The rough earth walls scraped their skin, and the darkness was so complete, it felt like they were being buried alive. Behind them, they could hear the muffled shouts of Harrison's men in the cellar. The chase was on. "Keep moving," Marcus grunted, pushing the box forward. His shoulders were wedged against the ceiling of the tunnel. "I'm trying," Kaya snapped back, her voice strained. She was pulling the box from the front. They moved like that for what felt like an eternity, inch by painful inch. The only sound was their own ragged breathing and the scraping of the box against the dirt. Every second, they expected a gunshot from behind, or for the tunnel to collapse and entomb them forever. Finally, Kaya's hands felt not dirt, but rotting wood. "I think this is it," she gasped. "The end of the tunnel." With a final, desperate effort, they pushed. The wood splintered and gave way, and they tumbled out into another dark space, followed by the heavy lockbox. They were covered in dirt and gasping for air. They were in the ruins of the old smithy, just as Silas had said. Moonlight streamed through holes in the collapsed roof, illuminating a scene of decay. A rusted anvil, a cold forge, broken tools scattered everywhere. They were out. They were free. "We have to open it," Kaya said, her voice urgent. "We have to see what's inside before Ayakoa's men get here." She pulled out the brass key. Her hands were shaking as she inserted it into the lock. It turned with a satisfying, heavy click. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were several stacks of documents tied with ribbon, a thick ledger book, and a folded, yellowed piece of parchment sealed with wax. "This is it," Kaya whispered, her fingers tracing the wax seal. "The original treaty." She picked up the ledger and opened it. The pages were filled with neat columns of dates, names, and numbers. "Payments," she breathed, "from Colonel Harrison to Ayakoa. Dates of raids, lists of weapons supplied. It's all here." But Marcus was looking at something else. Tucked in the corner of the box was a small, leather-bound journal. It wasn't a ledger. It looked personal. He picked it up and opened it. The handwriting was familiar. He'd seen it on military dispatches years ago. It was Harrison's personal diary. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the entries. It was a chronicle of greed, ambition, and utter contempt for human life. Harrison detailed his plans to incite an Indian war, to use Ayakoa to clear the territory, and then to betray him, leaving himself as the hero who ended the conflict, the hero who would be appointed territorial governor. But then Marcus found the most damning entry of all. It was dated just a week ago. "Takakota is a problem. The old fool refuses to see reason. He came to my office, demanding I honor the old treaties. He speaks of peace and coexistence. He doesn't understand that this land requires a firm hand. I have made Ayakoa an offer to remove his troublesome uncle from the board. Ayakoa has accepted. He will make it look like an accident during a raid." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. "Kaya," he said, his voice hoarse, "it wasn't just Ayakoa. Harrison ordered your father's death." The hatred in Kaya's eyes was so pure, so intense, it was terrifying to behold. "He will pay," she whispered. "They will all pay." Suddenly, the night was shattered by a war cry, and then another, and another. From the direction of the trading post came the sounds of gunfire, screams, and the thunder of horses. Ayakoa's raid had begun, ahead of schedule. "He's early," Marcus said, grabbing the ledger and the diary. "He must have known we were coming." "Or Harrison's men warned him," Kaya said, stuffing the treaty parchment into her shirt. "They're working together. They wanted us all here, in one place. Ayakoa gets the trading post, Harrison's men get us and the box." The sound of the attack was growing louder, closer. Flames began to lick the sky as the trading post was set on fire. They were caught between Ayakoa's warriors and Harrison's professional killers. "Where do we go?" Kaya asked, her hand gripping her knife. Marcus looked around frantically. They couldn't go back the way they came. The smithy was on the edge of the settlement, but the open ground between them and the safety of the hills was a death trap. And then he saw it. In the back of the smithy, half hidden by a collapsed section of the roof, was a heavy-duty freight wagon. Its canvas cover was torn, and one of its wheels was broken. But it was big, and it was full of empty barrels. "In there," he said, grabbing her arm. "Get in one of the barrels. Now." It was a crazy, desperate plan, but it was the only one they had. They scrambled into the back of the wagon. Kaya squeezed herself into one of the large, empty pickle barrels, pulling the lid on over her head. Marcus did the same in the barrel next to hers. They crouched in the dark, smelling of brine and fear, as the sounds of the battle raged outside. They could hear the warriors shouting in Apache, the crack of rifles, the splintering of wood. Then they heard new voices right outside the smithy, English voices, Harrison's men. "They're not in the tunnel," one of them shouted. "They must have come out here. Spread out and find them. The colonel wants that box, and he wants them dead." Footsteps crunched on the gravel right next to their wagon. Marcus held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could hear the men searching, overturning piles of junk, kicking in what was left of the walls. A hand slapped the side of his barrel, making him jump. "They're not here," a voice grumbled. "Let's go join the fun. Ayakoa's boys are making a mess of that store." The footsteps moved away. Marcus dared to exhale. They were safe for now, but they were still trapped. The raid would eventually end, and when it did, Harrison's men would be back to search more thoroughly. But then, something unexpected happened. He heard a new set of footsteps approaching the wagon, heavier, slower, and a voice he now recognized with a cold dread. "My niece is clever," Ayakoa said, his voice calm and commanding, just a few feet from their hiding place. "She and the white man have the package my partners are so interested in." He paused. "Burn this building, all of it. If they are in here, the fire will find them. If the box is in here, it will be destroyed. Either way, my problem is solved." Marcus's blood turned to ice. He could hear the splash of lantern oil being thrown against the dry wood of the smithy walls. He could smell the fumes. They were going to be burned alive. A torch was tossed. The dry wood of the old smithy went up with a roar. Smoke immediately began to pour through the cracks in his barrel. The heat was instantaneous, intense. He could hear the fire crackling, devouring the structure around them. He had to get Kaya out. He pushed against the lid of his barrel, but it was stuck fast. The heat had swollen the wood. He was trapped. He hammered on the inside of the barrel with his fists, but the sound was lost in the roar of the inferno. The air was getting thin, thick with smoke. He started to cough, his lungs screaming for oxygen. This was it. After everything they had been through, they were going to die here, cooked alive in pickle barrels, just feet from each other, but completely unable to help. He thought of Kaya, trapped in the barrel next to him, and a rage he had never known filled him. He drew his revolver. He had one chance. He pressed the muzzle against the inside of the barrel lid and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. The wood splintered, the bullet tearing a hole through the lid. He fired again, and again, blasting the lid to pieces. He scrambled out, coughing and choking, into a maelstrom of fire and smoke. The entire smithy was an inferno. The roof was about to collapse. He ran to Kaya's barrel and clawed at the lid. It wouldn't budge. "Kaya!" he screamed, his voice raw. He saw the barrel shudder, then the crack of a gunshot from within. She'd had the same idea. He fired his own remaining bullets into the lid, and together they shattered it. She emerged from the barrel, her face black with soot, her eyes wild. "We have to go!" she yelled over the roar of the flames. But Ayakoa's warriors were standing outside the burning building, their silhouettes framed against the fire, rifles raised waiting for them. They had walked out of the frying pan and into the fire, literally. They were surrounded, trapped between a collapsing, burning building and a dozen enemy guns. There was no escape. Just as a warrior raised his rifle to fire, a new sound cut through the chaos. A bugle call, clear and sharp. From over the ridge charged a column of blue-coated cavalry, guidons flying, sabers drawn. They crashed into Ayakoa's raiding party like a tidal wave, their carbines spitting fire. It was the army. But how? Who had called them? An officer on a gray horse galloped towards them, his face grim. It wasn't Harrison. It was General Morrison, the commander of the entire territory, a man known for his ironclad integrity. Marcus and Kaya could only stare, dumbfounded, as the battle raged around them. Morrison reined in his horse. "Captain Stone," he said, his voice booming over the din. "It's been a long time. I got your message." "Message?" Marcus croaked, his throat raw from the smoke. "I didn't send a message." "No," Morrison said, a grim smile on his face. "But he did." He pointed towards the edge of the battle, and Marcus saw him. Silas, the merchant. He was wounded, his arm in a bloody sling, but he was alive, and he was holding a strange, smoking device, a heliograph. He'd used a mirror and the light from the fire to signal the fort. The cowardly merchant had become a hero. The battle was short and brutal. Ayakoa's warriors, caught completely by surprise, were routed. Ayakoa himself, seeing his plan collapse, tried to flee into the darkness, but a cavalry sergeant rode him down, and he was taken alive. As the smoke cleared, Morrison dismounted and walked towards them. "We intercepted a communication from Colonel Harrison to this post an hour ago," the general said, his eyes hard as stone. "He ordered his men to rendezvous with Ayakoa and eliminate you both. He declared you deserters and criminals." Morrison's gaze fell on the ledger and the diary in Marcus's hands. "I have a feeling those will tell a different story." Marcus handed them over. "It's all in there, General. Harrison's treason. The whole conspiracy." Morrison flipped through the diary, his expression growing darker with every page he read. "I knew Harrison was ambitious," he muttered. "I never suspected he was a traitor and a mass murderer." He looked up. "He's at Fort McKinney, waiting for news of your death. I think we should go and deliver it to him in person." They rode to Fort McKinney at the head of the cavalry column, with Ayakoa and his captured warriors trailing behind them in chains. As the sun rose, it painted the walls of the fort gold. The gates swung open to admit them, and soldiers stared in stunned silence at the sight of their general returning with the territory's most notorious renegade in tow. Colonel Harrison was standing on the steps of the headquarters building, a smug look on his face. When he saw Marcus and Kaya, alive and riding next to the general, the color drained from his face. He knew in that instant that the game was over. "Colonel Harrison," General Morrison's voice boomed across the parade ground, "you are under arrest for treason, murder, and conspiracy against the United States of America." Harrison's smugness dissolved into sputtering rage. "On what grounds, General? On the word of this deserter and his savage whore?" Before anyone could react, Kaya slid off her horse. She walked slowly, deliberately towards Harrison. She held the yellowed parchment, the original treaty, in her hand. "This is the law of this land," she said, her voice ringing with clarity and strength. "A promise made to my people. A promise you and my uncle tried to burn." She stopped directly in front of him. "You took my father from me. You tried to steal our future." Harrison sneered. "Your future is dust, just like your father." He made a fatal mistake. He lunged for the treaty, trying to rip it from her hands. Marcus started to move, but he didn't need to. Kaya moved with a speed that was breathtaking. She sidestepped Harrison's clumsy lunge, her hand flashing out. Not with the treaty, but with the knife she had pulled from her boot. She didn't stab him. She didn't kill him. She simply laid the flat of the blade against his throat, the same way she had done to Marcus what felt like a lifetime ago. Harrison froze, his eyes wide with terror. The entire fort was silent, watching. "My future," Kaya said, her voice dangerously soft, "is just beginning. Yours is over." She pulled the blade away and turned her back on him as two sergeants grabbed his arms and hauled him away, screaming threats and curses. In the aftermath, the full scope of the conspiracy was laid bare. Harrison's diary and the lockbox led to a dozen more arrests, unraveling a network of corruption that reached the highest levels of the territorial government. Ayakoa, facing execution, confessed everything, hoping for a lighter sentence he would never receive. With the truth revealed, the threat of a full-scale war receded. General Morrison, using the old treaty as a foundation, began the long, difficult process of negotiating a real, lasting peace with the Apache leaders, including those who had been wrongly targeted by Ayakoa. Weeks later, Marcus and Kaya stood on the ridge overlooking the valley where they had buried her father. They had built a proper grave marker from river stones, and the land was already beginning to heal from the violence it had witnessed. "He would be proud of you," Marcus said, putting his arm around her. She leaned against him, watching the sunset paint the clouds. "He would be proud of us," she corrected him. "You faced your ghost, Marcus Stone." "I had help," he said, looking down at her. The warrior was still there in her eyes, but now it was tempered with something else. Peace. Hope. "And now?" she asked. "The world hasn't changed overnight. There will still be men like Harrison, men like my uncle. Then we'll face them," he said simply. "But we won't face them as soldiers or spies. We'll face them as builders." He looked out at the vast, beautiful, and dangerous land stretching before them. "There's a future to be built here, Kaya. A better one." She turned in his arms, and her kiss was no longer a promise of battle, but a promise of life, a promise of a home, built not on lies and stolen land, but on truth, courage, and the unshakable bond between two people who had found each other in the heart of the storm. They had walked through fire and darkness and had come out the other side, not unscathed, but stronger, together. They had a long road ahead, but for the first time, it was a road they were choosing to walk themselves. This story was a wild ride, wasn't it? From a knife at the throat to a conspiracy that threatened to tear the entire frontier apart. It just goes to show you that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on a battlefield, but in the hearts of people fighting for what's right. If you enjoyed this journey of twists, betrayals, and redemption, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We've got a lot more stories to tell, and you won't want to miss a single one. Let me know in the comments what you think. Should Marcus have trusted Kaya so quickly? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.